We were obviously a ways apart there, but after some discussion, we decided to meet right in the middle. A couple of days ago, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, your normal car guy talk about different cars that you might like to own. And in the conversation, I said something that honestly surprised me. And it was, there are times when I wish I had never learned about how exotic car financing works, because from a very young age, I've been able to buy just about whatever I want, not by being wealthy, but just by understanding which cars to buy, avoiding the temptation to always want the latest and greatest thing, buying cars that were a few years old that weren't really going to depreciate, and just financing every dollar that I could. And over time, I've made some money on these cars and at the very least not lost much of anything on any of them. And so it's kind of empowered me to buy just about whatever I want. So what that meant was that I really didn't experience a lot of the cars in terms of ownership between the B5 Audi S4 I had as a teenager and the Gallardo I bought when I was 20 years old. And as I worked my way up through exotics, I kind of always had my eye on the dream car of a manual LP640. And so finally, in about 2015, I was able to buy one, the green car that I loved and enjoyed every moment of, but I still had a gigantic $200,000+ loan on the car. But what I learned was, as I could manipulate the market and influence it by revealing the rarity of the cars and putting the VINs out there publicly, I was able to make the prices jump, and as we talked about in the previous video, use the profit to essentially buy a cheaper, storied version of my dream car for free. And I loved the gray car. I had it for almost 2 years, drove it about 10,000 miles, and did a lot to recondition it. I certainly would have probably put another 5,000 or 6,000 miles on it if it hadn't been down for some paint work and things like that during the time that I had it. But I loved it, made it much nicer. But I was kind of constantly bombarded by people who wanted to buy it. And while, yes, it was something I loved and could certainly have seen myself keeping forever, there's always that temptation to say, I'd like to own a McLaren before they all go out of warranty, which I would never imagine doing, or, maybe a Scud, or just some other cars that I love the idea of. Another Stick 360, an R8 V10 stick. There's a lot of cars out there that I'd really enjoy owning, not more than the Murcielago, but I'm young. I have a lot more car buying years ahead of me, and so having one big car that I love and could consider keeping forever sort of keeps you from the idea of wanting to go out car shopping, which of course for most of us is a favorite pastime, because I'm really just not in a position to have a whole fleet of exotics. The Roof was bought with the thought that maybe I'll love it for a little while, but I was always going to flip it at some point. The 993 came along and it's perfect to just kind of substitute some of the driving time that I'll have with the other cars, and certainly I'll make some money on it at some point. But I really just always had the temptation to try other cars. And with the manual LP640s, the 26th that I had found, and we've actually found a 27th now that VINwiki's live, so that was really, really cool. There's kind of two tiers of them. There's the really, really nice sector of them. It's probably 11 or 12 cars. And then the rest either have some miles or some damage history or a story or something like that, or maybe they've even been totaled. And that's what kind of limits the field. But interestingly, when you talk about the rise in values of manual cars, it's not really so that you can go park them in large collections. It's so you can drive them. So the liquidity in the lower end of the spectrum is a little bit higher. Those cars move more often. I sold my green car for about 350 grand, and I just sold the gray car, surprisingly, for 220. There was a guy who'd been trying to buy it for a long time, and he'd been asking me about it, all these different things, and he had an early Murcielago, and I kept saying no, and eventually he just decided to buy a Diablo 6.0 to put with it. But a few months later, not long ago now, he totaled the 2002 Murci, so he asked if he could buy mine again. And in probably a moment of weakness, I said yes. And I was kind of excited, I'm going to get to go car shopping. And I looked at a lot of stuff. I made some offers on some 599, something I'd never owned, a Stick V10 R8, another 360 Spider, a Scuderia or two. And I was making pretty insultingly low offers, but I got pretty close on a few of them and was just kind of deciding which one I really wanted to step up a little bit and buy. But I couldn't get that excited about any of them. I knew I'd enjoy them for a little while, but I also saw the writing on the wall that 90 or 180 days from the purchase, I'd get pretty bored and want to trade it in and probably want to go searching for another LP640. And a couple days after I had told this guy he could have it, I got a call from someone who had bought another 07 manual LP640 literally the day after I had bought the gray car. And I'd kind of counseled him through that purchase, and this car had about 39,000 miles, so a little bit more. I sold mine with about 23. And it had been documented that a couple of years prior to that, this car had been sort of unaffectionately modified. It had a big old rear wing and some gigantic aftermarket wheels and all the taillights and headlights tinted black. And it was a black car, which was certainly not my preference. And so I had looked at this car, and it was a nicely optioned car with carbon fiber and ceramic brakes and stuff like that. But it had lived kind of a hard life. There were still holes where the wing had been, and it still needed a lot of reconditioning, and it probably needed the front end resprayed and some stuff like that. And so this guy was looking for his first exotic car and wanted something that wasn't really going to depreciate on him. And so this was a good candidate. Now, generally, I don't advise Murcielagos as someone's first exotic cars because they're so useless. And you kind of need to warm yourself up with a 430 or a Gallardo or a 458 to kind of what it's like to live in the world of regular cars with something fairly exotic before you go to something that's probably 5 times as hard to use in a modern daily driving context in a Murcielago. So right after I had bought the gray car for $120, this guy bought that car for about $175, and he knew he was going to have to put some money into it, and he was kind of excited for that to be the project. So he got some stock wheels for it and did some cleanup and took the tinting off the lights and had the car, you know, looking pretty nice, and was about to start doing the paint work when he called me. He said, "Hey, I'm sending it in, but you know, I'm also kind of thinking I might just want a Huracan. I might want something that's just easier to hop in and drive, that I can take my wife to dinner in and she's not going to complain about it," and stuff like that. I said, "Sure, well, that's kind of an interesting call." I said, "Well, what have you done in terms of the paint?" Because we knew what it was going to need. And he said, "Well, I've sent it to this body shop. They're just about to do the whole front end. They're going to redo the bumper, the fenders, and the hood. And then we're going to do the deck lid, obviously, alongside the quarters that have the holes drilled in them. And they'll probably blend on and redo the rear bumper as well." I was like, wow, you know, he is the roof, the doors, and the rockers shy of repainting this entire car. And like I said, I hate black cars. The 993 is black. It's already filthy. And I just couldn't probably do that. But the prospect of being able to pick my color 10 years after the car was new was pretty interesting. And the color that I have always loved on the Murcielago is called Verde Draco. And you might recognize it from the press car that was used on Top Gear in their first review of the LP640. In fact, there was another right-hand drive UK car that was a stick. The Top Gear car was E-Gear that was this color and has been for sale a few times. And I have always just loved it. It's kind of this drab, metallic, goldish green, and it has just such a unique presence to it, and it started to become a little bit more popular. I know there's a Huracan Spider in Europe, that color, and there's a Performante as well, but there's nothing in the US, and no US Murcielago owners ordered that color. And so I knew I was never going to be able to just buy a car that color, but if I found a good candidate for a color change, it would be something that I'd be interested in. So I started talking back and forth with the owner of this car that was looking to move it, and I said, "Hey, you know, let's talk about it. What do you want?" And he wanted 250 grand for the car, which certainly, you know, once fixed up and ready to go, it might bring, but I wasn't interested in paying that, and having just sold mine for 220, I kind of wanted my end investment to be something in that range, and he'd probably spent about 10, so he had about $185 into it, and so I said, "Look, I'll give you 190 for it." And we were obviously a ways apart there, but after some discussion, we decided to meet right in the middle at 190. So a few days later, my technician, who used to work at Lamborghini Atlanta with me, but now does independent work out of his shop, we flew to Phoenix to check out the car in Scottsdale. And we got there, and the car was kind of exactly what we were expecting. There were a few more things that it needed. It had an ABS light on, and someone had stolen the windshield wiper, and a few other things that we can obviously manage through sourcing some parts. And he had told me flying out there, "Look, you're welcome to check it out, but I'm not going to take less than 190, which was a bad challenge to set down because obviously I had to talk him down a little bit more. So I got the car for 185. And I'll end up with probably 20-ish in the paint and probably another 10 to 15 in general maintenance and catching up on things and stuff like that. But I'll end up with my dream car in my dream color in the US that's never been stolen, which is always a nice thing. But I just really could never come to terms with owning something else. I mean, certainly I've talked about wanting a Veyron one day, and maybe I do, but the marginal enjoyment that I would get out of that car relative to this, just another manual LP640, is never worth the margin of value difference, since maybe it'll happen one day, I don't know. But for the meantime, there's just no other car that makes me happier. It kind of fills all the things that I think a supercar ought to be, and I can't wait to get behind the wheel of it again.